Welcome, everybody. It is Tuesday, June 5th, 2018. This is the Kubernetes Release Special Interest Group. I am your co-lead, Jay Singer-Dumars. And if you want to follow along after the fact, the agenda is available through a long URL that is not convenient anymore to recite. So yeah, hop on the SIG release Slack channel and we'll drop you a link to the agenda there. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into the agenda. And today we've got a relatively full agenda. And also I want to welcome some new people. It looks like if you're new to this SIG and you want to say hi, I give the microphone to you for a moment. Anybody feeling new and excited to be here? Well, okay. There are new people. Apparently, they're not excited, but that's okay. I mean, this is the most exciting SIG, I have to tell you. So other SIGs are really boring, so don't even waste your time. Ours is the best SIG. So anyway, yeah, so going through the agenda, the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that we don't have a charter. And so I would love to have volunteers. It looks like Stephen has already stepped up as a volunteer to help draft the charter. But I would love to have some other folks involved with that as well. So it's not just writing a document. This is actually creating a foundation for the policies for this SIG moving forward. So it has a lot of implications and a lot of impact across the project. So this is a very serious matter, and I would love to have people step up either to help draft or to work with Stephen to do that. So anybody feeling so inclined?
Tim is volunteered as well, so we can work together.
Great, perfect. So what I'd love to do is have you all create a draft and put it on GitHub, and then we can review it as a SIG in the future, and we'll go over that.
Sounds good.
Okay, so part of that is that we need to look at how we move the release team to a sub-project. So this is a really interesting use case for the sub-project model because technically the release team doesn't specifically own code, although one could argue that they should in terms of release-related code. And I would love to, once we have a draft in place, to have a good discussion about that, because it would be interesting to see what would it take to move the release code and the things like Anago and whatnot under SIG release. Apparently, the other Zoom channel is working for some people, and they are there. So hopefully they'll be coming here soon. Maybe. Sorry, guys. This is the most unorganized SIG meeting ever. Another thing that we need to talk about once the release charter is in place is that we have a fair amount of overlap with SIG PM. And specifically SIG PM, if you don't know this already, staffs the feature lead role in the release process. And so one of the things that we're going to try and do for 1.12 at the end of 1.12 during code freeze is to try and help SIGs do planning for the next release cycle. And so SIG PM is going to help do that. And I would love to have a lot of input and cross-pollination with the release team and the release SIG to find out how best to plan for those things. So, for example, let's say that SIG cluster lifecycle is going to do a big push to do some sort of crazy meta-netties thing that has self-replicating clusters or something, and it has a big impact on the community. If we, as SIG release, are involved with that, if we are involved with that planning process, that allows us to actually pre-scope whether we need to get docs into the project for the release, if there are specific merge concerns or things that need to be handled in the release process. So the better alignment we have with SIG PM and the planning process, the better it's going to go for the project as a whole, and the better the release process will go. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk about that. So
is SIG PM working on a charter themselves also, and would it make sense for us to see where we overlap there?
yes, there is a PR for that. I'll have to find it. And there is a relatively high amount of overlap.
I'll put up the PR. It's I'll link it here.
Thank you very much. We'll get into some release policy stuff here at the end of the meeting, but some of those policies are going to show up in the draft charter as well. So any questions, concerns, ideas about the charter before we move on to the next item? All right. So release artifact, signing and validation. Tim Pepper, you were going to look at this and maybe do something, and this was so long ago that I completely forgot where this was at, but I put it in there anyway.
So I was curious to understand, just from a broader security design perspective, if we had an overarching threat model for the release process, or if whatever threat modeling had happened already for the project from a functional perspective, like when you're running a Kubernetes cluster, how much of that backed up to the release process and requiring trusted artifacts from the release. So I chatted with the security folks a bit, and they indicated that there wasn't an existing threat model that captured this. They would be interested in seeing one. They hoped that we would volunteer to create that. And I'm interested in helping contribute to that. And then one other question there, sometimes these things are sort of sensitive in their draft phasing, and they felt that this would not be the case here. So we can discuss and draft in public and collaborate towards a threat model, and then figure out within that context how signed artifacts support that to create a trusted supply chain.
Great. Cool. Anybody have any comments on that? We're gonna bump another item into the agenda here from Sham about scalability pre-submits. But does anybody have anything on artifact signing and validation before we move on?
Just that I know that there's some teams at Google that are very interested in this general area. They're trying to get better provenance over the entire build, and kind of more security over how it's performed, rather than just like on the branch manager's workstation. And that I think signing would definitely be related to those efforts, as well as any threat modeling.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the signing process, the actual implementation, is going to depend heavily on how the build process works. And right now that is tied to particular Googlers is somewhat problematic in a way. But as that gets broken out, the implementation should consider how to ensure the provenance of things as well.
This might actually be a perfect case for where involving people from the update framework or Notary, which is used for signing artifacts, something we actually use here for signing anything that goes out into a production-like environment would be perfect. And then that way you can do some pretty strong key management and sort of more democratize the release, build, and push up to a place process, which is what I think you're talking about.
Well, perhaps, yeah. I think I have maybe two conflicting strong opinions on how this might be done, and it kind of depends on how users would intend to consume this. I think right now someone who's particularly concerned about this is probably going to build their production binaries themselves as opposed to download them from the project. But there, I think we need to understand the actual use cases a bit more and see who's looking to consume them, and then what the verification path would look like for them, and how automated that would become, whether it ties into the update framework or what the mechanisms look like. But I think right now we're at a point where we got to understand really the top level requirements first.
Yeah, if we can leverage some prior art on this, let's definitely have that as part of the investigation. That would definitely be good. Okay, so we need to loop in the Google folks that are working on this, and any recommendations about other OS projects that we can leverage would be good. Anything else before we move on to scalability pre-submits?
Did we end up with Caleb on the call, on this call? No, it looks like not. Okay,
yeah, he has a SIG release.
Okay, so I was curious to chat after KubeCon in the release discussion there, talking about the portions of the build process that are connected to Google employees and how that's being broken out. I'd be interested to find out more on sort of the status and timeline of that, because it would obviously tie into whatever we try to accomplish with provenance improvements.
Okay. Do you want to put that at the end of the agenda?
Yeah.
Because Sham has a preempting thing that he needs to talk about. So you got the floor, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Jace, for bumping up this on the agenda.
Yes.
So, yes. So finally, I think the well-awaited action on the scalability scenario of the project. I think so. I've added a couple of scalability pre-submits, and like I've kind of stabilized it over the past few weeks. I added it more than a month ago. So now they're actually running against every single PR. This means that every single PR in the Kubernetes project right now, in the Kubernetes repository, is being scale tested. So the one final step before actually helping us with our scalability effort, like to save all the issues we see close to the release with scalability and like all the lost productivity. So I basically want to make these blocking. And I just discussed this with the SIG testing folks in the SIG testing meeting that happened before this. And yeah, the main concern was basically that these tests, like one of the two tests, which is the 500 node kubemark test, takes longer than the slowest test right now, slowest pre-submit right now. So the slowest one is close to an hour, and the kubemark 500 runs for an hour and 20 minutes. So yeah, but we reached the consensus that we want to add these both of these as blocking pre-submits right now, given the kind of value they provide to us. Because I actually had a short document giving stories of scalability regressions from the past, and like I have data to basically assert that we'll be able to catch about 60% of regressions that we saw in the past with just these two pre-submits, that is the kubemark 500 and the 100 node GCE test. So yes, we wanted to make sure that this decision is transparent to the release team as well. And I think Jace and Josh, you as well, I think you guys probably know how much of a pain in the ass scalability gets close to the release. So this is our first step towards actually avoiding that. So if you're able to block like 60% of regressions from getting into the code base, like even before merge, this is kind of a good win for us. Yes, and regarding the increased time due to adding these pre-submit, right now it doesn't seem too big of a deal because we are in the code freeze period, and we actually don't have the queue too long. So this is not like going to hurt our throughput much. But I'm going to work on some ways to fasten up the kubemark 500 as well, so that it isn't the bottleneck of our merges. So yes.
Do we want to look at any kind of regular expressions to catch things like Go files as opposed to documentation changes, or because I have a concern that I go in and change a bunch of documentation. Now I'm spinning up a 500 node kubemark cluster to do that. So are there some ideas about how we fine tune that over time?
Yes, this this same exact question came up in SIG testing, and like folks are basically asking like if there are some trivial changes or like some set of changes that we don't actually have to run the tests against. And this was actually my suggestion that like to start with, the most trivial ones are like documentation changes or like typo fixes and things like these. So yes, we can probably do that. So yes, for trivial cases, we can probably do that. Of course, we also need to think about if it's worth doing that. Like this basically adds some extra complexity in that like we are going to basically have pre-submits selectively on some PRs. But yes, I mean, it does sound like a reasonable idea. We probably want to do something with this at some point. But for slightly non-trivial changes, it usually is hard to like just eliminate that it doesn't cause scalability issues, because I've seen like even a single word change PRs cause like devastation with scalability in the past. So that's a hard problem to actually like.
No, I think it's like an XS change can easily break everything, right? I mean, it's just.
And it has happened more than once, like at least in the recent past.
But certainly a change to a markdown file is not capable of such a thing. So it's sort of like maybe we can at least do some rough hewing of it once it's in place and look at how we might do that. Because I have a lot of concerns about just the time over the current pre-submit time and the cost associated with spinning up clusters for no reason, and so I just want to be mindful of how we're using resources to solve a problem that is a really big problem. And thank you, by the way, so much for doing that. I think it's just a matter of how we fine tune it.
Yes, yeah, we definitely can work on that. But actually, it turns out that the rate limiting factor, from what I understand, is not actually the pre-submit running against like the PR, but the pre-submit actually running against the tied batch, because that's what is actually the main limitation, because this longer test is going to make the batches go in a bit slower, so that can affect the throughput. And for batches, I would say that like it maybe does not make give us too much of a benefit doing this, because I would assume that out of a batch, like on most occasions out of a batch, there would at least be one non-trivial PR. So yes, but with respect to cost, we might probably want to save some. Though these tests are not actually super expensive. I've actually did a very quick calculation, and it turns out that we are like spending something like a couple of dollars for like a few PRs, like 5 to 10 PRs. I think we spent something like $2. So probably not too much at this point, but yeah, we can think about it. Sure.
Okay, cool.
Just one more point. The bigger issue that we wanted to raise right here was the timing of making this blocking. Shyam was proposing to make it blocking in the next week or so, which would be into code freeze, which means if there's any critical PRs that we need to get in, it's going to take slightly longer to get them in. So just wanted to get a sign off from the release team for that.
Thoughts on that, Josh?
Sorry, no, I'm actually double timing because code freeze starts in 2.5 hours. So I was not nodding at the screen.
Okay. So the question was, the plan is to make these tests blocking in the next week or so. So which would mean that if there are any critical PRs that need to go in during code freeze, they might take that much longer to run. So do you just want to?
I don't want to add new blocking tests during code freeze. That just seems bad.
But Josh, like there is a purpose of adding these new tests is that if some fix is actually introducing a regression, we shouldn't.
Got it. Okay.
So we want to stop them. And so, like adding to what I said, personally, my opinion is that this extra 20 minutes of time that we add in this scalability pre-submit is really negligible with respect to the time you spend for reviews and like addressing those reviews, and in general the lifetime of a PR is like much larger than this extra 20 minutes the PR is going to add.
Also, the only breakage we've seen with these tests recently was due to a change that would have been caught had they been blocking.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The yeah, no, I just being concerned because we're having a bunch of tests right now being flaky that really shouldn't be flaky. Adding more tests, adding more blocking tests is a little bit worrisome just because of concerns about having stuff refusing to merge. But
yes,
the rather than what's specifically in the tests.
Yeah, with scalability tests, I can say that the flakiness is like really super low, and the scalability tests are one of the most taken care of tests. Like at least the small scale ones, we are kind of ensuring like a more than 99% health, like over the long time horizon, especially these jobs that I added for pre-submits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just concurring there that as far as that I see breaking from the test infra side, scalability is very consistent in quickly addressing issues, which is a big plus as far as wanting to make these blogging. We've definitely been a little bit concerned about like how long it takes and things, but at the moment it should be fine, and we have plans to improve it in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just please, let us all know via release channel or whatever exactly when these are getting turned on.
Like today, can we do that today? Unless someone has.
I mean, are we going to turn them on right at the beginning of code freeze?
I don't see any reason not to.
That would be better, honestly, because people are expecting things to change when we turn on the code freeze box.
Yeah.
So
I would want to do it as soon as possible so that we catch any regressions that might happen, because these keep happening so frequently from time to time that I would really suggest having it soon.
There's a PR out now, and there was quite a discussion about this in SIG testing. We just wanted to make sure that it was okay by the release team before anything was merged.
Okay. Yeah, so let's plan on turning that on around the time that we also flip on the switch for code freeze.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Which is in 2.5 hours, so.
So I probably will be asleep, but I guess the PR is out there. Yeah. So.
Okay, right. Unless, I guess, you want to wait until you're awake tomorrow morning.
I think it's fine. Like, it's not a complicated PR or something. It's there out, and I guess it's kept on hold or something, I guess. Yeah.
Great. Thank you again for doing that work.
Yeah.
That is so great to see the feedback come back and actually get turned into something that gets done. So thank you.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, moving along in the discussion. So release cadence discussion. This is a hot potato, and it's something that comes up from time to time, and I just want to have it on our radar to talk about. Right now we do 4 releases a year. There are many problems with this. One of the problems that we run into is that the 4th release of the year, which is over the holidays, is notoriously hard to staff and also avoid having critical milestone dates fall on holiday days. So basically we really get 3 full releases, more or less, and then a 4th kind of loosey-goosey release. I would love for us to talk about how we negotiate with the community and with ourselves and all the processes we have in place about how either we keep the release train that we have, which is the quarterly release train, or we change it to 3, or we change it to more frequent releases. And that is a discussion that I would love to start. I don't know if right now is the right time to do that or not. What is the mood in the room on having this discussion?
I think we should, but I think it needs to involve a fair amount of maintainers, particularly the ones who would like a different cadence, because I'd like to hear more about what problem they expect it to solve exactly. Because certainly the ones who talked to me wanted a slower cadence because what they were imagining is that we would have as many features in a 4-month release as we currently have in a 3-month release, which would make the workload a bit lighter. The thing is that I'm not sure that it would necessarily work that way.
Yeah.
I'm highly skeptical it would work that way.
I mean, there's a minor issue that in terms of arranging the release calendar, that doing the quarterly releases is difficult for both the midsummer and the midwinter releases in terms of making a release schedule that does not involve doing important things where lots of people are gone. And a 4-month release would make it that slightly easier to schedule, but that's a pretty minor reason to change anything on.
So something I had considered as a possibility is so 3 full releases, and then for the last quarter we do 2 release segments. So one is just like a bug fix sprint type release that doesn't have any features. It's just like a hackathon against bugs and docs and all that. So that would be from basically January, February. I have a stupid calendar. What are the last 3 months of the year? December, November, October, November, December. So basically October and up to Thanksgiving would essentially be a bug fix hack. And then after Thanksgiving, so Thanksgiving to the end of the year would basically be optional, just people can work on whatever they want. And it's not necessarily a specific release segment per se, but there's, slack to do whatever in that time frame. So basically it's just kind of open season on bugs, or if people want to try a hackathon project or whatever that is. But essentially the project as a release team would go dormant from November 22nd to December 31st. Thoughts on that?
So I think we need to better define some of the stuff that's actually in the next topic before being able to do something like that. I'm not saying I disagree. I think it actually is a pretty good plan. But but I think there's some of the things that we need to tighten up on the release team overall before being able to do that.
I'm not completely sure I agree or understand why those would be impacted, but help me understand.
Well, from a planning process overall, if we're going to start bringing actual SIG planning into the mix, we can't. How are we going to convey that to SIGs? This is only going to be bug fix time, or this is only docs time. How do we convey that without defining that process first?
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder though. That's an interesting thing. The content of the release. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. So I'm gonna write a quick note in here. So 3 plus 2 release idea, and I'm going to put as a dependency that we need to how to gate release content. Okay. Any other thoughts, ideas about release cadence, timing, etc.? Okay. So I put an agenda in here for what release policies are missing. I think there's a lot. These are things that we have to contend with, it seems like, every release cycle. And there's some things that we haven't had to contend with yet, but we need to know what we'll do if they do. So let's go ahead and dive in. So this came up recently. Documentation is a blocker. There's a very spirited debate about this. And Jordan Liggett was kind of on the side of, well, this shouldn't necessarily be a hard blocker. Misty, our docs lead for this release, is very much like this absolutely should be a blocker. So I would love to get people's thoughts on this as an idea.
Yeah. Why is documentation as a blocker controversial?
Because it's not currently.
Yeah.
And,
so,
and I can name some founding contributors who would fight tooth and nail against the idea.
Yeah, basically people who don't work at product companies or.
Yes.
there is also a bit of an argument for trying to be more pragmatic. I don't necessarily agree with the basic premise that was given, though, that developers don't or can't or won't prioritize writing documentation. So code will always come first with a lag of documentation. If you do buy into that, then it becomes a reason why making it a blocker is hard.
Yes, I would say though that anyone who works for a company building a product on top of open source Kubernetes, at least larger than a size, we'll say 20. I have not met I've not seen a single feature produced at any of these companies where a reasonable draft of documentation would not have been ready at the same time or really preceding the delivery of code.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally
have
agree.
not seen it.
This is a basic part of quality software engineering, and from my perspective, I don't think it should be acceptable that the culture is to say, well, we don't want to go there. We should be trying to improve this.
I have another concern. I think there's a time where a lot of alpha features and even beta features are underdocumented and are kind of excused for being underdocumented because they're alpha and beta features, when are arguably time that we need to be making them accessible to people so that they try them out and give us feedback on them.
So, just as I'm also on the release team with Misty. I share her sentiment in saying that documentation is important. I wouldn't go so far as to say that every I and T would need to be crossed. I think something like everything that made it as a feature in Kubernetes features absolutely should have documentation surrounding it. Without question, before the release goes out, with the docs deadline, it should be blocked. Other PRs that go into master, while I think it's extremely important, it may not necessarily be a blocker, because we actually had a conversation earlier today with SIG docs, is like, do we need to have similar to an owner's file inside of each package where its code changes here, it triggers a documentation block where it needs to change too. So that's still in progress. I don't know where we'll arrive at that, but I absolutely think that every single feature that actually is logged in GitHub as a Kubernetes feature should have some documentation surrounding it and should block the progress of it. Because just like, is it you, Caleb, that was saying product teams that actually have to build stuff on top of open source Kubernetes that need documentation? We're absolutely in that boat. And I'm just an operator for our company. Like, we absolutely need documentation on some of this stuff, so when it goes wrong, we have ways of pointing fingers, or at least figuring out root causes.
Yeah, so the question is stuff that isn't in features but is user facing, because there's plenty of that. There are various labels that can be applied to a PR, like docs required. I think there's also a user facing docs required now. Is that right? Somebody who knows this?
I don't know. I've never seen that label before.
I thought we were going to do that, and
I think there was discussion, but I don't think it actually happened yet.
Yeah.
I would love to see the birth of the user-facing docs required label. That would be the thing, and that actually would be nice to have that applied by somebody who could be the PR author, or it could be somebody who's on the release team, or somebody that's managing features.
Well, I think the complication comes there, is Josh was explaining in the meeting earlier today that he produced a spreadsheet of example PRs that aren't features that would require docs, and it took him, Josh, it took you what, 3 hours to do that?
I've been working 3 to 4 hours every day for the past week and a half.
Which
it's a ridiculous amount of human effort to keep track of these things if we don't have an automated way to do it.
Yeah. Oh, Josh, I'm so sorry. I know your pain.
You're intimately familiar with this.
Yes, I am. We need to end this tyranny. There's way too much manual stuff. Okay, so just to summarize where we're at, in my opinion, based on this conversation, we need to figure out who this is controversial to and figure that out. I want to hear some real objections to this. But otherwise, we should assume that the documentation should be established as a blocker for things that make sense. And the make sense part, we can determine over time, and we can figure out how to enforce that. But bottom line, entropy should not be a reason to not have docs. That's not an acceptable reason.
I think if you can convince Timothy St. Clair, then opposition to the idea will collapse.
All right. Well, he is one and we are many, so we'll see how that goes. All right. Cool. Moving on to the next item, reverts. There is a lovely little caveat in the release process that says if we don't like your stuff, we can yank it out. But this to me has many implications and is not well defined or documented, especially in a world where there is no such thing as a feature branch, really. I mean, the CLI team is doing it, but this is something that is incredibly tricky to do even on a good day. So I would love for us to maybe have a discussion at some point, and it doesn't have to be now, but like let's come up with what a actual revert policy looks like, because right now it's just we're like a shark with no teeth when it comes to this. We can say we're going to revert your stuff, but the minute somebody lays a commit on top of something that we want to revert, then things get really tricky. So thoughts?
How many times have we, or has the release team attempted to do a revert in general, and have we had ones that have failed?
In my experience, we've never actually reverted anything.
Yeah, we have. We reverted some stuff that was causing scalability and performance breakage in the last week.
But
we did it the manual way by basically doing the original patch in reverse.
Yeah, right. But you didn't revert the commit. You
No, because that would have been prohibitively hard.
Right. That's what I'm saying, is that there are things where we're actually reverting the commit is a threat, and we don't have a good way to do that.
Without feature branches, I don't see that we have any way to do that.
Right.
In the case that you're mentioning, Josh, was that the release team wasn't doing that, right? That would have been the owning SIG.
Actually, I think some folks from scalability did it. The actual chains, but yeah, no, it would have been. Yeah, no, but it was not people from the release team writing the reverse this out code in any case.
Yeah.
And by the way, that shows you what the actual threat model for reverse this shit is, which is the reason why we would do that is somebody commits something and tests are chronically failing, and we figure out that that commit is why tests are chronically failing, and for whatever reason we don't think it's fixable before release.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that we would like to be able to do in a much cleaner way. Not stuff like, hey, you didn't you didn't do all the correct process, and therefore we're going to back this out. I don't think we've ever even considered doing that. We
talk about
made nasty comments to people who don't follow process, but we haven't even threatened to remove their code. Yeah,
and that's the thing, is we talk about it, but we don't do it, and it's really the only stick that we have to beat people with, and it's and I mean that in the nice way.
So to clarify the workflow here, you're imagining that the release team would actually push the button on revert, and then it would be up to the SIG to come back and justify re-implementation and fixing.
Well, yeah, the policy as written, when you read the revert or the documentation about the release cycle, we have the explicit power, and nobody's challenged it yet, to, if we felt that something was a risk to the release, that we can pull it out.
So I guess I'm trying to understand how, like, in my mind, that scenario plays out like we have gotten to a point where we have an adversarial relationship with a given SIG and our interactions with them have failed, and that we have chosen to proactively revert their code against their desire to not revert it.
So that is a scenario. The more likely scenario is that somebody wrote some code, it gets merged, they go on paternity leave, or they decide that they want to go to the Bahamas with no internet for 6 months or something, and nobody in the SIG is qualified or knows enough about the thing that got merged to be able to cogently work on it. So
okay, so that I feel like is in my experience, that's a slightly different level of risk management need. So I would call that unmaintained or unmaintainable code, which is a different path that you arrive at typically than like a critical release blocking situation. Now, certainly the timing could show up just horribly, like as a race condition, like the release is happening and the person has gone on vacation. So I get where you're coming from.
Well, there's also the real world examples of where we had scalability problems and it was very hard to get anybody to work on it because time differences and staffing, and there's not very many people that actually know how to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And even just Shyam just now, I mean, it was midnight for him, right?
Yep, that's right. So there are instances where this is a real thing. But I think that you're right. You raise a very interesting point, which is unmaintainable versus policy violating code. So policy violating code would be code that doesn't stand up to documentation requirements, or is maybe implementing something that the release team just feels like, wow, you guys totally snuck in a feature that shouldn't have been in, or stuff like that.
Or promoting something to beta even though has not gone through alpha and nobody okayed it being promoted to beta.
Or that.
And actually we have another case that ties in directly to the previous discussion, which is somebody putting in a user-facing feature and saying, oh, I'll finish the docs a month from now.
Yes.
And that's one where actually I have already had to use the threat of reverting stuff in 1.11, even though it's a hollow threat.
Yeah.
Because people were telling me that oh, I'll do the docs later after release. And I'm like, no, no, that's not what you're going to do. It's not okay. It's not okay with me. It's not okay with the docs team.
Yeah.
Do the docs now, or let's move the feature to 1.12.
So we definitely need to have a more focused discussion on this. I think that this is something that needs more, and plus real policy document out there on our site. Okay, moving along. Revisiting the requirements for the release lead. Currently, the requirements are a whole bunch of things. I'll paste in chat so you can take a look at these. I think that we need to validate whether these are hard and fast, or these recommendations. Why are there any requirements at all? Yes, are there requirements that should be in that list that aren't? Do we need to make people take a basic GitHub proficiency test before they sign up as release lead, or so basically. We just need to revisit this and wonder.
I think the practical requirements are at least 2 terms on the release team, one of them as a section lead.
Yeah, as opposed to a shadow of the release lead.
Yeah, and I think there's a bunch of other sort of requirements that are like, must be an org member, must have certain group permissions, etc. But these are all things that we add if somebody becomes a release lead. So they're not prerequisites.
Yeah, so if you look at the thing, it specifically mentions you must be a member in good standing and part of the Kubernetes org.
Right.
And you must
if somebody was volunteering to be release lead, well, the thing is, they wouldn't, the way we do things these days, they wouldn't make it through 2 terms on the release team without already having become a member of the org. Because now the first thing we do when people volunteer for the release team is say, hey, are you already an org member? If not, let's make you an org member.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So what I would love to do is, if anybody is so inclined to make changes on here, please put in some PRs.
Okay.
and assign me to them for sure. Because this is a document and policy that I wrote, so I would love to be able to review that.
Yeah.
All right, moving along. Better define requirements for other release team roles. That is big +1 on that. Just to understand what are helpful skills and whatnot.
Yeah, right now we have, what is it? We have like lead sort of defined and bug triage and like 1 or 2 other roles, and the rest are kind of undefined.
Yeah.
So Josh, you also mentioned there were some, you had some interest in creating a PR triage role as well.
Yeah, that would be a new role. It's just that because that is not a defined role, and because the issue triage role has grown so much in terms of the amount of time it consumes, I'm finding that as release lead, I'm spending a lot of time triaging PRs, and that points to needing a role for that.
As issues were no longer required for PRs, you start to have this disjoint set of tickets within GitHub, the issues and the PRs, and it adds a complicating dimension to tracking.
Do we need to, as a team, address that and come up with, re-implement the policy of tying issues to PRs, or?
I wouldn't go that direction. I mean, right now we call it bug triage, and issue in that case, people have fairly deliberately pushed back against having the additional process overhead of having to tie to yet another artifact on the PR, and quite often I think we'll go and kind of hunt and find the bug or the feature that's pre-existing to which that they could say, well, this PR is associated with that. So I think people will just kind of work their way around it, and that doesn't help the situation of the release team trying to do active risk management, like trying to understand, is this a low, moderate, or high risk PR, regardless of what its basis is, bug fix, feature, whatever. So with the volume of stuff going by, I think each of these having somebody who's focused on it, and even like this release has been fantastic in my opinion because we have Aish as CI signal lead. All of those test fails basically map to issues, right, or bugs, but it carves off a big chunk of them so that the bug triage can focus on a subset of things. So each of these being a slightly smaller domain with a focused person, I feel like ends up being much more effective.
And then one of the other things looking at it long term is if we had better automation, then some of these roles would become less time consuming. Like the reason that bug triage and PR triage are so time consuming right now is that an awful lot of the work you're doing is honestly copying and pasting things just to keep track of them. And that's something that computers should do for us. But making those automated has been, it's been a slow process because of technical difficulties.
On the plus side, this week, GitHub has more funding for these types of feature enhancements in the platform.
Yeah, right. Yeah, don't expect them to do anything useful for the next 6 months at least.
Okay, so moving along. How are leads actually selected? There is no process for this. We've had a spreadsheet in the past, and people put their names in, and it sort of happened quasi ad hoc, but
yeah, I think my suggestion would be a simple process. One is where we have a specific timing, like specifically, X number of weeks before the beginning of the next release cycle. We have a SIG release meeting where we have a call for nominations.
And that is actually the documentation currently is
okay.
That. So, but continue.
Okay. Well, that's it. I think that's a fine process.
Also, the decision process though is really missing. Like who are voting members of the SIG and who.
So I think it would be kind of cool to have the incumbent release team have some sort of lazy consensus on a nomination for a new release lead.
and not have it be part of the SIG?
I mean, I still think it's I still think there should be a nomination process. But if we're saying that release team itself is going to become a sub project of SIG, I think this was a different meeting, though, right? So if release team is going to be a sub project of SIG release, then it's not actually a decision for SIG release itself, but it's a decision for the release team within SIG release, right? So there should be its own defined process, and if there are overlapping members within SIG release, they're also part of the release team sub project, then yes, you get a vote as well.
And then the tiebreaker would essentially be the technical leads or the chairs of the SIG.
Yeah.
Or whatever
Exactly.
that looks like. Okay, that makes sense.
Speaking of which, since we don't have that process in place now, can we use a simple nomination and vote of those present for 112?
We could. I'm fine with lazy consensus too. If we want to put, so one way to do that is to put the PR out for the 112 team and get comments on it. So
I have an issue up for the 112 team already. So if you guys want to attach PRs to that, I have nominated myself for features lead. I think that's gone in already. I think Tim Pepper, you had some interest in being on the team too.
Yeah, I was about to nominate Tim for release lead.
Yeah, I would.
I'm really loving the idea of actually having a release lead before the release.
That is
the previous cycle.
The process as documented is actually that one of your duties, Josh, if you look at your job description, is actually to do that very thing.
Okay.
I'm also a big +1 on Tim, and also this is part of the thing about the requirements of the lead is Tim technically is not shadowed lead, but he's been involved deeply in the release process, and wide support. So yeah. By the way, I want to pre-ask, or I want to see if there's a possibility that Aish would consider being the release shadow for 112, the release lead shadow.
Sure, I would love to do that. It's I hope I'm up for it. I'll try to shadow Tim and see where it goes.
I would love to see you take a shot at being the lead for 113.
Okay. Okay, sure. I'll definitely discuss it with my manager here, considering the other tasks that are up for the next quarter. But thanks a lot for considering, and I would love to learn more.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that if we do shadows right, then we should at least have the current, or the next release cycle should have some idea what we're doing, and then shadow for the next should be in place, so we have more, basically 6 months window of planning. So if you're the release lead, a release out, so let's say for 113, then that gives you enough time to orient your work and get approvals and all that good stuff ahead of time, which I think is important because it's a very time-consuming thing, or it can be.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for the support. I will definitely do that. Yeah, thanks.
Cool, awesome.
Yeah.
Anybody else that's interested in shadowing, like step up, and let's assume that Tim is nominated as the current reigning heavyweight champion of release lead for 112. Okay. All right. So we are running out of time. We have 3 minutes. I don't even think is the next one. Stephen, you put this in just a minute ago. Do you want to hit this, or do you want to save it for the next meeting?
I think we can punt it because I think it's a bigger discussion. What I would like to say at least is the so there's a mention of like, okay, how do we select the release lead, but also how do we select the other roles within the release team? And I think you should have the option, if you're already on the previous release team, to remain in your role or be ousted or something like that, or move to a different role before the rest of the nominations go in. So.
Okay. All right. This has been an absolutely fantastic discussion, everybody. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it. If you have any things that you want to talk about after the fact, please hit either the mailing group or the Slack channel, and we'll go from there. So see you in a couple weeks.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.